So anyway, one of the subjects that we've addressed many times on the program that again has, as so often, brought us much criticism is I have consistently over the years criticized Dr. William Lane Craig and his apologetic methodology, partly because I don't think Dr. Craig has ever shown evidence of seriously considering the criticisms that are made of his position from a Reform perspective. I mean, we covered the Cy Ten Bruggencate stuff, 4 or 5 months ago, maybe. And the Reasonable Faith brought podcasts he did on that. And it was just painfully obvious that he's never really listened to what we have to say and really isn't interested in listening to what we have to say. But the biggest issue with Craig has always been a stance. As such, it is of necessity eisegetical. It's sub-Christian, and I think it's extremely problematic. And we've especially talked about what's called the grounding objection, the idea that. Well, let me explain it first. We always have new listeners, and so I can't always take things for granted. Though you can't always just start from the beginning either. Historically, theologians, even before the Reformation, had recognized two kinds. I hate to use the term in God's mind, but in God's experience, two kinds of knowledge in God. There is the knowledge that he has of himself, not of his actions in time, but of him, exhaustive self-knowledge. And then there is that knowledge that would encompass everything that he chooses to do. And since he's the creator of all things, would mean exhaustive knowledge, sort of how we would view omniscience. Because anything that happens in this vast, vast creation of his comes from the fact that he chose to make it in the way that it is. And so since everything is dependent upon him, there can't be any knowledge outside of what he has chosen to create. And so you have these two kinds of knowledge, which one is sort of like internal of himself and then external of what he's chosen to do. And that's it. There isn't anything else. Most theologians up to that point in time, that's good enough. But then, at the time of the Reformation, primarily, there are some who have hypothesized. I've never seen any strong evidence of this, but I haven't spent much time on it. There are some who have hypothesized that some of the Anabaptists developed some kind of concept of middle knowledge. I question that. Most of them didn't have long enough lives to have ever done anything overly in-depth along those lines. But certainly, Louis de Molina, the Jesuit philosopher, is the one that's credited with the development of the concept of middle knowledge. And it's a little bit like the situation with CBGM right now, in the sense that the Germans have come up with a lot of the phraseology, and it just isn't overly descriptive. It's not really helpful. We're stuck with it until somebody comes up with something better. And middle knowledge, what does that communicate to anybody? You're the middle kid? middle what? Well, I guess it is descriptive in a sense. It's supposed to be logically, not temporally. And that's where people get confused. It's logically between, hence in the middle, between those two kinds of knowledge that I explained. The knowledge that God has of himself, and then you have middle knowledge, and then you have the knowledge God has of everything he has made. And so that's where the term came from, but most people are just sort of like middle of the road, middle Earth. Has something to do with Loader. So anyway, the idea of middle knowledge is that God has access to, and it's not easy to follow, but primarily because you're normally trying to plug it into categories that it's not even claiming its own. Or the idea is that God knows what any free creature would do in any given circumstance. Now, we automatically default to the final kind of God's knowledge, and that is, well, yeah, God knows what I'm going to do because he made me and because he knows me so well. That's not middle knowledge. That can't be middle knowledge, because that's the last form of knowledge, and this is before that. This is before God's decree to create anything. And this is where the real problem lies. And that is, it's saying that God has knowledge of what person X will do in any given circumstance before God decrees to create person X. Now, when I think of God's exhaustive knowledge of me as an individual, that is absolutely connected, without question, to his sovereign decree to make me who I am. So I really, 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 really struggle with the idea of even conceptually thinking about there is person X, and if person X is placed in this universe, person X will do this. And if he's placed in this universe, or normally they say worlds, but what does that really mean? I sometimes wonder, I haven't heard anybody ask him this, but I wonder if anyone's asked him, would middle knowledge remain true in a non-carbon-based life world? I mean, how can you even, would middle knowledge be relevant in a black hole? I don't know. These are odd things that you can think about, but the point is that this idea of middle knowledge does not come from God's decree to create. It constricts God's freedom in what he can create, dependent upon what his desired outcome is. And this is where a lot of people go, wait. Constricts God's freedom? What do you mean? That sounds a little weird. Yeah, it does. But what's important to realize in Molinism is that God does not determine the content of middle knowledge. So if you have person X, and they'll do this in this circumstance and that in that circumstance, that is beyond God's control. What determined that is beyond God's control, because it's middle knowledge. It's not knowledge of he himself. It's not knowledge of what he's going to create. And this is what we call the grounding objection. Then where did it come from? Who determined this? There's no answer in Molinism. It just is. Just the way it is. And we have often played the clip where Dr. Craig, in answering a question about evil as a Molinist, says, well, look, God's got to play with the cards he's been dealt by middle knowledge. To which I go, then we need to be worshiping the card dealer, because the card dealer is superior to God, because the card dealer sovereignly determined what free creatures would do in any given circumstance. Either that, you have to say, well, nobody did that, which means now the very form of any possible world is determined by some it's fate. It's just fate. Determine these things. This is the grounding objection. It's been the objection. Francis Turretin made this the essence of his argument in his Institutes of Eclectic Theology. And I believe it's an absolutely valid, unquestionable fatality to the Molinistic system. Aside from the fact that it, from a biblical perspective, is utterly underived from Scripture. It is fatal to the system. There's just no two ways about it. And so what it does is it reduces God to this great cosmic computer who, taking middle knowledge, is able to run all these possible worlds, and on the basis of those possible worlds is able to go, well, if I put, I don't know how many billions of people have lived on this planet. It's not all that big a number because the population in the past is much, much smaller than it is now. But let's say there have been 20 billion people. If I put 20 billion people, and how many possible people are there? That's another question. Honestly, I haven't thought of before. Is there an unlimited pool of possible people from which to draw? It doesn't sound like there would be. Because if there was an unlimited number, then I would think God could create any universe that he wanted, including one where everybody would get saved, if there is a unlimited pool from which to draw. So maybe there's a limited... Who determined that? I don't know. But what God does is he runs all these scenarios. And if I put these 20 billion people into this world with these external circumstances, and what they'll say is God's sovereign over the external circumstances. So he gets to do all the tsunami stuff, and earthquake stuff, and plague and hail and fires and all the rest of it. He gets to do all that stuff, and he can micromanage all the external stuff. So he can make sure to put you in the circumstances where he knows what you're going to do, this, and this. So he's absolutely sovereign over all of that. But the data coming into the God computer doesn't come from within it. It comes from without it, which is this middle knowledge that nobody knows where it came from or where it's derived from or who determined it or anything else. And so there are certain worlds God can't create. Well, there are certain worlds that God may want to create where everybody gets saved and there's no evil. But there wasn't any way, there was no combination of people that would fit God's ultimate design, which I guess is maximum number of people saved with minimum amount of evil. But we don't know that. It's not said. Certainly not in Scripture, because no Scripture writer ever thought of any of this, that's for sure. And so this is Molinism. And this when you see Keith Lee and these other folks that are just all gung-ho on Molinism and middle knowledge and all the rest of that stuff, just keep in mind, this is what they're talking about. And once you describe it to most people, they're sort of like, I don't remember that in Isaiah. And I say, you're not going to remember that anywhere. Because, as I said, no biblical writer ever even thought about it. So I was directed to a video that was posted recently with Dr. Craig. And here's him basically saying what we just said. We're not misrepresenting anybody. Here's what happened.
According to that definition.
Yes.
Are there any other things that God can't do?
Yeah, I think that here we come to this issue that is raised by God's omniscience and the theory of middle knowledge, which says that there are statements about how people would freely choose in certain circumstances. And the interesting thing about these kinds of statements is that they are contingent. They are not necessary truths like the truths of mathematics. In different possible worlds, we may choose differently in the same circumstances, so they're contingent. And yet they are independent of God's will. God doesn't determine how you shall freely choose in the circumstances that you find yourself in.
Okay, did you catch that? I want you to see that. I want you to hear that. That's what we're talking about. It's independent of God's will. It's not a part of his creation. There is something that can constrict God's actions and determine what God can do that God did not create. Separate from his will. That's what he just said.
And what that means is...
So God is not then free to determine those acts.
That's right.
So that's a limitation on God's own freedom.
Yes, that's right. Because these are logically prior to his decree to create the world. And so...
To catch that? Logically prior to his decree. So, again, it's logically prior. So, his natural knowledge of himself, middle knowledge, and then the decree. So the decree is dependent upon middle knowledge.
If he has knowledge of these, they're called counterfactuals of freedom, about how people would act if they were in certain circumstances.
Define those terms, counterfactual.
Well, a counterfactual is an if-then statement in the subjunctive mood. Like, if I were rich, I would buy a Mercedes. Now, I'm not rich, so I don't, but if I were, then I would. That's a counterfactual. It states an if-then hypothetical in the subjunctive mood. And the idea here is that God knows the truth value of all these counterfactuals about how creatures would freely choose in any circumstances they might be placed in. And if he does know these prior to his divine decree, then he doesn't determine those. He doesn't determine how you would act freely in any circumstances you might be in. And therefore, these lie, in that sense, outside his ability or power to determine. Now, what that means is that there are logically possible worlds which are not feasible for God to create, because if he were to place the creatures in those circumstances, they wouldn't do that thing. They would do something else. So the theory of middle knowledge says that are all of these possible worlds that God knows that are possibilities, but then there's a subset, a proper subset of these, which are all of the feasible worlds that God could actualize, given the truths of these counterfactuals of freedom about how creatures would act.
And
now, did you catch that? Given these truths, these counterfactuals, in other words, given middle knowledge. So what God can do, circumscribed and determined by middle knowledge that he did not create. That's not a part of his will. That's what's being said. That's pretty straightforward in his own words.
then he chooses the one that he thinks are the proper ones to make real.
That's right. And then he will pick one of these feasible worlds to be the actual world. And so that's a very interesting, I think, limitation upon God's freedom. Again, it's purely logical because it's based upon the logical impossibility of making someone freely choose something. That is logically impossible. It's contradictory. So it's not...
Now, what you just heard, interestingly enough, is the assertion that compatibilism is logically impossible, which is exactly what the radical Calvinists are saying from the other perspective. So here you have the Molinist and says there can be no compatibility between God's decree and man's freedom. And then you've got the people on the other side saying, that's right, which is why it's God's decree that determines everything and not man's will. So you get here's the two polar opposites, both saying that the idea expressed in Genesis 50 and Isaiah 10 and Acts 4, not logically possible. That's what happens when you cut stuff down.
Not an infringement on God's freedom that goes beyond logic, But it does have very interesting implications for God's providence over the world and for the evil and the imperfections that are in the world. Because it may be that there was no world feasible for God in which everybody always freely chose to do the right thing. It's possible that in any feasible world, some free creatures at least would go wrong and there would be sin and evil in the world. So this has very interesting repercussions for questions about the evil in the world and the other imperfections and limitations in the world.
Yeah, it does have huge ramifications, actually, massive ramifications, because there's just nothing biblical about what was just said, unfortunately, and that's the problem. Well, where did that go?
At 36.
Okay. And I'm just trying to find, is that coming through? Almost. Because I can't, it doesn't show me what it's sending you, so. Okay, let me try this. No? How about that? Got to find something other than this someday. It just doesn't work on this end. Okay, what?
Now, before you move on, I have a question. And I don't know the answer to this question, but I remember a while back you were talking about weather systems, weather patterns, and how they're affected by movements, and you talked about the butterfly.
Yes,
And I wonder sometimes those
are fractals, by the way.
In Molinism, is that kind of thinking that what if the butterfly doesn't take off?
No.
No, there's not.
No, Molinism is just the opposite of what you'd have in process theology systems, open theism systems. It has extreme micro control providentially of all circumstances, but its whole purpose is to try to maintain the idea of an autonomous human will, while at the same time affirming absolute divine sovereignty. The cost of that is the introduction of something that God did not create and controls what he can and cannot do.
Okay, and then the second thing I want to point out is that in listening to him describe that, I found it interesting how convinced he is of it, and yet he refers to Molinism as a theory. Mm-hmm. And yet he treats it as fact.
But he's a philosopher.
Well,
and so he's doing what he's doing what any good philosopher is going to do. He's going to refer to it as a theory.
Right.
Yeah. There's no question about that.